name's Edward. I'm a regular on the UKTEC, the UK's largest independent tournament circuit, and here are 5 things that I learned at my first Old World GT this week. Number 1, positioning. Now, if you've played 40k, you know that positioning in the deployment zone it's somewhat important, but usually what you want to do is hide all of your stuff behind terrain so that you can't be shot off the bird turn 1. This isn't something that you have to deal with in Old World. Maybe some incredible shooting skew list can punish you, but most of the time what you want to do is put your units where they need to be. Something that I hadn't really considered is the fact that in 40k your units can move in any direction. In Old World you're incredibly limited, so even something like a flying caster, I had an Orc Shaman on a Wyvern, I can only really move 9 inches, and I do have to still respect the wheeling, other rules for movement, so I'm quite limited in where I can get the influence of my spells if I deploy in the wrong spot. Something that I didn't sort of factor into that as well is that if you deploy your artillery on or near the line, you're probably going to get charged on turn 2. Doesn't matter if that's where the hill is in that map. Don't put your artillery on it. That's a bait. Put them further back. Use your units to screen it more effectively. Something else to consider is that where you put units is where they need to be. So I was running some Black Orc infantry, and I found that they never really got far. I was playing more of a defensive list, some artillery that I was defending with Night Goblins and Fanatics, and then some Black Orcs as well. But really, I found that they moved probably less than 12 inches in most of the games. So very important in Old World, where you put things is typically where they're going to end up unless you're playing something fast. Number 2, damage output. I ran both a unit of Night Goblins with shortbows and a unit of Orc Skirmishers with warbows. And I think between the 2 units across the 5 games, they probably killed something like 8 to 10 models. This is something that I hadn't really respected coming from Old World. I'm used to, if you have something out in the open, your opponent's going to be able to kill it at range. And that's just sort of the world that you live in. In Old World, you find that things have much more set roles. The damage that they do is kind of secondary to what you're expecting them to do. So you can't just look at something and expect it to die. In my last game, my opponent moved a Dwarf Gyrocopter out into the middle of the board with the intent to do some shenanigans if it survived. It's only a T4 3-wound model with a 4-up save. If this was 40k, that is disappearing immediately. Turns out I put my entire army into it and only did 2 wounds. It then charged one of my war machines the next turn, which was incredibly sad for me. What this means as well is, with units tied to their roles more than in 40k, you have to really consider what you're putting in a list and why you're putting it in the list. Whether you want it to be a screening unit for artillery, whether you want it to be something to aggressively take the flanks, a war machine hunter. And again, that's something that I really hadn't considered when I was writing my list. I was kind of just going, these seem like the most efficient units to put in my list. I think they'll all play together well and do some sort of homogenous role. Moving forwards, definitely going to be changing that one up. Number 3, because damage is so low, with some exceptions for, pivotal units, static combat res is king. I ran a Black Orc Warboss BSB on a chariot. Between the BSB War Banner Standard and the Close Order from the model itself, it had a static combat res of 4, and I could war to get +5 in total. This meant that even if I was charging that into a unit and my opponent was challenging me out with the champion, typically a good way to deal with characters who are on big beasties, I was still typically getting something like a 9 to 10 combat resolution at the end of the combat. So despite the fact that I wasn't able to kill that many models, I was making units break and flee, being able to follow up, get the impact hits on the next charge as well, which was really nice. This is going to affect how I set up my units as well. So I was running a unit of 8x2 Black Orcs. I think over the entire weekend I only got to charge twice with those. So I think what I'll be doing is moving towards a 6x3, maybe looking at stacking some more combat res into there, putting something like the big red Raggedy Flag, a magic item, magic standard that gives you +1 combat res, but also +1 weapon skill. Quite nice defensively, given that I found they got charged more than they were doing the charging. I also probably will use my Night Goblins in bigger bricks. I was running a 6x5, but I found that they got whittled down very quickly in comparison to how long I thought they'd keep that static combat res. So something to consider for the future. Number 4, Swingy Games. Now, if you've watched the podcast or if you've seen me in person, you probably know that I'm not a believer in dice losing your games in 40k. Now, that's probably still the case to an extent in Old World, and it's one of those as I get more and more competitive, I will find that my games, I can attribute less and less to dice and more to the micro mistakes I made through the course of the game. But Old World is so much more swingy. There's so many more layers of reliability that you have in 40k. You're typically hitting and wounding on much better rolls, so you know that you're going to be getting consistently better rolls. If you're hitting on sixes because you've moved and they're at long range, you're not going to be hitting very much, but you could spike up and, do more than you're expecting. Something that's really important here is charges as well. In Old World, I haven't seen anything that's sort of a pure shooting army yet. Maybe one exists. Haven't come across it yet. Probably would be miserable to play against, so very happy not to have done so. But because melee is so pivotal in the Old World, where you're getting into combat, maybe killing stuff in combat, but realistically trying to run them down or, force them out of the battle line, get some flank charges, play more around the positioning. If you fail a pivotal charge, say you hit the front of a killer unit with a big unit of night goblins, but then fail the charge into the flank with the chariot that's going to be hitting them with the actual damage and some static combat res, that can cause real issues, and that can really flip a game. Make your unit that you charged in completely worthless. They get into combat, lose the combat, immediately run away, and then your opponent has some freedom to do what they want to with their models on their turn, where they've given them movement to get into your lines potentially. Or even just if you've gone into the game of footsie, where a lot of Old World is positioning to see who is going to be able to get that charge, meaning that a lot of the time you might actually be getting a longer charge instead of a shorter one. If you need a 5 or a 6 on the dice to make the roll, sure, you roll 2 dice, but it's not unlikely that you don't roll a 5 and a 6 on either of them. Maybe you just stumble forwards, and then next turn your opponent gets a nice charge, which is going to make a huge difference to the outcome of the game. Number 5, limitations in the Old World are much more punishing and harder to overcome than they are in 40k. Stuff in 40k we have is, for example, you can't charge after you advance. But a lot of the time, the build around that is either your combat army is very fast or has other ways of getting up the board, such as, scout, or you just have advance and charge. Maybe it's an army-wide rule. Maybe you've got it as a strat. Maybe it's very easy to access, and that's typically how, you just go, oh, it's a combat army. Of course it's got advance and charge or a 12-inch move or something along those lines. Whereas in Old World, overcoming limitations, because there are so many more USRs, there are so many less exceptions for each USR, and you'll find that you'll come up in situations where you go, I wish I could overcome that. A big one for this is leadership. Obviously, if you're playing something like a leadership 7 or 8, standard middle of the range leadership army, and you've got no ways to increase your leadership or affect the rolls, you're probably going to have a bad time over the course of the event. You're going to fail some pivotal terror checks. You're going to be breaking from combat where you might have, just fallen back in good order. Lots of things that can happen there that really alter the course of the game. Whereas if you have those ways to overcome them, such as, for example, a rule like Veterans is very strong because you're able to just straight up re-roll all your leadership tests. Terror tests, don't care. Just going to be re-rolling that one till the day is gone. If your opponent, you've got a unit that's panicked next to them, you can re-roll that. Or if someone's caused panic in you because they've shot your very valuable unit, Veterans, re-roll, job's a good one. I've still got most of my valuable unit. On the theme of leadership, obviously stubborn, very good. This means this is something that you can plan around. So get into combat. If you are charged by something that you know is going to make your brick of troops flee, but you have stubborn, what you can do is the turn before you can position to know that you're going to fall back in good order, which is, fine. Your opponent might follow you up and chase you, but you can set up your units to get potentially a pincer flank. So either once they've charged you, they have to follow up and you get 2 flank charges, or you get a flank and a front charge in the next turn. Lots of potential in the positioning that you can move around there, unlocked by stubborn. Whereas, if you flee, that unit might just go straight through them, and then if you flee, that unit might still just go straight through them. Sure, then you get the charge potentially, but you've had to spend an entire unit to do that, which might not be something that's worth doing at that stage of the game. BSB, obviously, a very good rule here. Slightly nerfed from previous editions, as I understand it. All it does is affect the rolls for the combat break tests, but still good to have, especially if you play something like Undead, where affecting those crumbles is very good. Final point on the ignoring rules. Stuff that ignores armor is very strong. The points per wound can be quite high in Old World, and you might have something that is, single wound models like a Grail Knight that is really leaning on that armor save, and that's their only real their only real defense. Sure, they've got a small ward save afterwards, but if you're hitting them with something like Vile Tide, every wound that goes through is a dead model. That's a huge blow for a spell to be able to just rip through a unit of Grail Knights if you roll well, because all you're doing is taking away the defenses, and all they have left is, the T3 body that has maybe a 6-up ward save against Vile Tide. Another example of this is something like Plague of Rust, obviously a very strong spell from the Law of Elementalism. Absolutely fantastic. Your opponent might be sitting there with their layered defenses, and you just strip away, 2 of the armor save. The lower AP that you have in this game compared to 40k means that suddenly you're still getting them to like base, no save, making them rely on a ward save if they've got one, something along those lines. Thanks for watching. That was the 5 main things that I learned from my first GT at Square, based here in Nottingham this weekend just gone. If there's anything that you think I should know before I go to my next event in August, please do let me know in the comments. I am very much still in the learning phase of this game, but I'm loving it. I am going to be playing lots more games in the run-up to this, hopefully. I'm looking to add another bit of silverware to my collection. If you want to find out how I did, spoiler, the trophy in the thumbnail there wasn't for winning the games, but if you want to find out about it, do watch the Close Order podcast coming on Wednesday this week. I'll be talking to Lewis about how I did. And then on Thursday, I've got an interview with James Ramsey of 40k Team England fame. We'll be talking about the state of play for vampire counts. Really looking forward to that one. Thanks for watching. Try that again.